District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
Now, two pigeons bemoaning the fact you can stream DirecTV satellite-free.
These humans can stream all the top-rated national news channels on DirecTV, and now with no satellite dish.
This just in. Weather, sports, election coverage. DirecTV has it all, but something is missing. The satellite dish.
What are you doing?
I'm reporting the news. Back to you, Bob.
Here's some news. You're a buffoon.
Stream the top-rated national news channels. No satellite dish. Visit directv.com. Internet required. Top-rated news based on 2023 Nielsen ratings.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like, to check you have the tickets in your wallet first before you drive 2 hours to the big game. Seriously, you had one job. Now the closest you'll get to the 50-yard line is parking lot D. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Earlier this year, our podcast was shining a light on natural asset companies. And in my policy-making capacity, I worked very closely with our guest today on the podcast and a whole coalition of different organizations and folks to help stop the SEC rule to codify NACs into law. There's a lot still overhanging with natural capital accounts. We still hear about 30 by 30. The Harris-Walz campaign would certainly keep 30 by 30 alive. Were they to succeed, we would see the Trump-Vance campaign or potentially likely administration peel back at 30 by 30 or remove it entirely. And so we brought back Margaret Byfield to talk about all that is happening on this front. Margaret, good to have you back on the podcast. It's been a while, and your perspective is extremely invaluable. You've led the fight here and drawn a lot of awareness. You got Congress to care about this issue and a lot of the grassroots. So your work here is extremely pivotal, and we're glad to speak with you about what's happening currently in this front.
Thanks, Gabriella. Well, compliments back to you too. You were the first podcast to discuss natural asset companies when that rule came out. So, we are forever grateful to you for getting this information out there so people could respond and could help us stop it. So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And before we go into what is currently happening with natural capital accounts, we're speaking today on the heels of the COP16 Biodiversity Summit, which is the UN summit relating to biodiversity. And I think listeners are aware that Agenda 2030 is where 30 by 30, or the American variety, the America the Beautiful initiative, in terms of how it's whitewashed here in this country, how it got its origin and where it derives from. So people from around the country, if not around the world, are meeting in Cali, Colombia right now. I think actually some of our friends are there to kind of investigate what's happening. We couldn't make it down there just because logistically, I did not want to be kidnapped. Just kidding. No. But we do have some representation there to kind of give us a view, and I hope it's going to be somewhere safer in the future. I would be curious to attend this. And they're talking about 30 by 30 stalling. It's not making as much headway and progress. They're saying that there's currently $200 billion that is underfunded through COP's kind of examination into implementing the biodiversity framework. So even with kind of this initial reading and details into this conference playing out in Colombia right now, what is your whole view now that they're saying that, it's about action this year, they're underfunded? Is it because there's pushback to 30 by 30, or are they having momentum going forward? Why do you think they're kind of putting out this mixed messaging at the conference?
Well, I do think they're getting pushback. I think that they are getting more pushback than they realized, and that they thought they would be further along. So that's a credit to our side of the fight. But we can't. We know that they're going to continue to push this. As you mentioned, this had its roots in 1980. The iterations of 30 by 30. So once they get these kind of plans going, they never really quit. And And so I think even though we may be seeing some success, and I do think we are, I think we're part of the reason why they haven't been able to do this, particularly stopping the natural asset company, investment company here in the U.S. That's set them back big time. And so I think also it's a combination of the whole messaging, this nature crisis, the climate crisis, is based on a false narrative. And people are starting to see that. They're starting to see that renewables are certainly not the kind of energy that we want to depend on. It's unreliable energy. It's super costly. It has to be subsidized. More is coming out about how the mismanagement of land when it is in a consolidated state, either by government or by environmental nonprofit organizations. And I think what's really starting to get exposed is that this whole movement has never been about conserving the resources. It's always been about who is going to own the resources. And my dad said this years ago, he said the environmental movement is not about whether we're going to use the natural resources, it's about who. And, the natural asset company issue is the one that I think really brought that full circle. And people who were, in theoretically thinking, I agree in conservation. I think we should preserve some nature. Started seeing that this whole agenda to create more of that through 30 by 30 was more about profit and transferring assets to others to profit from rather than actually conserving nature. And that's what I think is getting exposed, and more of that gets exposed every day. So I do think that we've seen them in a little bit of a panic where they're pushing really hard to get this agenda in place, particularly with the election coming up here in the U.S. But all of that being said, it certainly is momentum for our side, and it's something that we cannot take our foot off the pedal on this. We have to continue to apply the pressure.
Absolutely. And this is largely actually playing out in the private sector. And we see conversations between kind of these Wall Streeters and Biden-Harris government officials to develop a framework in response to what is happening at COP16, the UN, all these big conglomerates. And this is very much in line with environmental social governance. And what a lot of these companies are trying to do is to essentially buy indulgences to kind of make themselves immune from any criticism, even if they're engaging in very environmentally unfriendly practices, which is really funny that it kind of greenlights this. And there's actually a lot of debate over whether or not companies should really wade into this. Is this going to be productive or reductive, rather? And what people can kind of take away from this Montreal Biodiversity Compact that was agreed to 2 years ago is that if you claim you're setting 30% of lands and waters for conservation, you're going to be rewarded with reducing of subsidies for businesses that harm nature. But you have to mandate, or you have to rather report your environmental impact, which is very hard to do. And a lot of people can kind of cheat the system to showcase that they're actually improving the environment, but they're not, because they can buy good carbon credit scores and other ESG scores to really inflate their performance. So it's been a lot of scrutiny and controversy over these practices in ESG, and same with these kind of nature credits too. It's the same scrutiny, if not more, going into it. So, Margaret, how many percentage-wise or millions of acres has the Biden-Harris administration closed off to multiple uses? I think I saw it's now 41 million. It could be a lot higher. I think it's actually a lot higher in terms of what they've closed for recreational opportunities, closer to 100 million. But in your estimation and your organization's examination into 30 by 30 and the work that it's done, or rather the gains that it's made, how many lands so far have been closed off to multiple uses or locked, essentially?
Well, the Biden-Harris administration released at the first of the year that they had added 41 million acres to the 30 by 30 agenda. So that could be, locked down in a number of different ways, but ultimately very restricted. A portion of that is going to be the conservation easements on private land. And so, but that's just what's been reported. I don't think we have a good sense of all of the land that is being encumbered with these conservation easements in perpetuity. I get a news feed every day which triggers anything that comes up on conservation easements, and I see the thousands of acres going under conservation easements every day. So I think the number could be much greater. And then there's another component of this that we don't really understand how it plays into it. I would say generally the people don't understand, but it is certainly a component of the 30 by 30 agenda. And that is all of these federal conservation programs. So there are a lot of conservation programs that private landowner can enroll in to help them with agriculture production and even just, some general maintenance like rebuilding fences and things like that. And the Biden administration has really, really pushed these programs, and through the Inflation Reduction Act has put a ton of money in these programs. Well, the reason is because anytime you attach federal funding to your property, you create a federal nexus to the property, and other laws can come into play, like the Endangered Species Act, which now the critical habit applies to your property where it wouldn't otherwise. And so those federal dollars attached to private land, they are happening, all over the nation. And that's like another layer that's not even being counted in this. And so I think the number of acres, that they claim that they have added to this is the 41 million. But I think those acres that they've set up to now push into the 30 by 30 agenda is much greater, and we're much closer than we realize.
They have made some groundswell advancements on that front, but I think going off of what we can surmise, and this will obviously come out before the election, but if we think it's going to go in a direction we think it'll go, 30 by 30, I think, will be staved off if you do get a Trump-Vance administration, because a lot of the people we know who used to work in the Trump administration will likely be brought back. Republicans have come out against 30 by 30. I think only a handful of Republicans, I think maybe one, supported it when it was a resolution, but most Republicans, elected Republicans, came out against it. So if you get that scenario in terms of an outcome, you will see it not codified by Congress, not signed by executive order by a would-be President Trump in a second term. If you were to get a Harris-Walz administration, as I mentioned, you will see it probably, and depending upon how Congress is, you could see it codified by executive order, which would be very scary. But as we spoke about earlier, natural asset companies are kind of on the back burner. They're still a threat, of course, but natural capital accounts is something my listeners should be aware of. Could you explain briefly what those are, how they're related to NACs? And while they're not official Biden-Harris policy, they have the potential to potentially be enacted in some way or form or present a threat. So explain what that threat is.
Yeah. Well, first on 30 by 30, 30 by 30 has been enacted by executive order, but it can be undone by executive order. So that's what we hope with the new administration could be accomplished. But unraveling that, it's been so entrenched through the administrative agencies that it's going to take a little bit more than an executive order. But I think each secretary is going to have to kind of whittle it out of all the agencies over the next 4 years. But the natural capital accounts issue is the one that we're most focused on right now, as far as we know. This is the next step in the agenda. So if we don't get a change of administration, this White House strategy, this plan that they published in January of 2023, it's on the White House website. The acronym for it is SEED. It is a plan to create a new line item on our federal balance sheet. Okay, so you think of your company's balance sheet, they're going to add a new line item to the federal balance sheet called natural capital accounts. And what is going to be included in this, April of this year, right around Earth Day, that there'll be 4 categories included in this natural capital account, natural capital account line item, which is land, water, air, and environmental services. So we know what's going to go in the environmental services. That is this new created right that they're trying to create by monetizing natural processes that nobody has a right to own. Things like pollination, photosynthesis, health benefits from being out in the open air. This gets back into the ESG concept where they're actually making up a property right that has a subjective value, not a consumer-driven value. and will create undue harm to our economy because it's all subjective. The federal government is attempting to do what NACs were trying to do, monetize these natural processes and use it to increase the U.S. net wealth on our balance sheet, which we believe is to increase collateral, to increase the national debt. So in other words, so that the federal government can go more in debt, which we certainly don't need it to do. So the environmental services, that's the one component of it. The piece of this, though, that I think was pretty startling to me, because it is such an affront to property rights. And I think most people who hear this are still kind of stunned that they have this in their plan. But they say in their April release that for the land component, that private property in America is worth $32 trillion. Okay, private property, that means the home I own, the home you own, whatever property people own, they are thinking that's what makes up $32 trillion. That's what they say in their release. And then they say that if that was added to the federal balance sheet, that would increase U.S. net wealth by 30% of what it is today. So that was in the press release, which obviously got my attention. Interestingly, they do not give us the figure of how much the federal lands are worth. In other words, the lands that the federal government owns, they don't even mention that. They just focus on the value of private property. And then when you click on the underlying document to this that they attach in their press release to support this statement, if you go to the conclusion, it says very clearly that private property needs to be added to the U.S. federal balance sheet as a part of the U.S. wealth. Now, that is a step that I think is crossing a major line. The federal government does not own our private property. You know, we've had this conversation before. America was settled differently than other nations. In other nations, the kings own all the land, or the government owns all the land. And then the citizens are given a sense of a property right. Maybe they own it for 99 years, but ultimately it's the king and the government that are sovereign. America was established in the exact opposite, where it was the citizens that would own the land. The citizens were the sovereign, not the government. And so that's why we have so much private property and why we can protect that property, because ultimately the government doesn't own it. But this is really changing that direction. It is kind of a backdoor way of claiming, at least using the private property as a security, collateralizing it. And therefore, if it's security for the national debt, then whomever we owe our debt to has a claim on the private property in America if this is allowed to go forward. And I hope that's kind of clear, Gabriella. I mean, it's kind of one of these crazy ideas, just like NACs. I think it takes a while for people to get their arms around it. And it's unbelievable that our federal government would be attempting to do this.
Not surprising. And I think this is probably occurring because there's no real clear definition or protection of property rights in America. Is there anything in Congress? I know in the Bush era, I remember reading, and I think I asked you or someone else in the various different coalitions we travel in, if there is, let's say, does the government recognize property rights? Is there anything to your knowledge? Maybe that could help solve this problem if Congress were to actually define what a property rights is or looks like and says that it is permissible. I mean, you don't need the government's permission to have a property right, but I don't think there's any, let's say, overt acknowledgement that there is. Is that probably why we're seeing this dilemma, you think?
You mean for the environmental services?
No, just in general. In general.
Oh.
Like,
we have the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment says that no property shall be taken without just compensation. So, except for a public purpose. And then what's been, debated through the courts and through cases has been, what is that public purpose? And so we've gotten to a place where that was first intended to be simply a government function, where the government could come in and condemn property if there was a public need, particularly for a road or something like that. But that's now morphed to where there's authority for private companies, like the carbon sequestration pipeline summit, carbon pipelines in the South Dakota and that 5-state region where they're trying to create carbon sequestration, capture the carbon sequestration and then pipe it to North Dakota and Illinois to pump it into the ground. They're able to condemn property in South Dakota prior to even having the public utilities permit to do that. So we've gone way beyond the original intent, the constitutional protection of property. But the founders understood what property was, and they understood that it was more than land. They understood that your gun right was a property right, that freedom of speech is a property right, freedom of religion is a property right. All of those rights in the Bill of Rights are property rights, and they were not to be infringed. So, yes, I mean, there's a clear understanding of what is property, and that's why this whole concept of trying to create this new property right by monetizing natural processes makes no sense and defies our laws. Property, in simplistic terms, you can understand is it's something you can contain and you can exclude others from. So land and water is a good example. Even intellectual property rights, copyright on a book, that is something that you can contain. It's your property, and you could decide who you want to sell that to and release that to. But something like pollination, you can't contain it and you can't keep people from using it. So those are things that have always been considered, taken into account with the value of property of the land. So they're known as externalities. So you could take the value of a piece of land that has a nice clean stream going through it. It's going to have one value. If that was a polluted stream going through it, it's going to have a different value. And that's how that has always been accounted for. But it's never been considered a separate right that somebody else could own on top of that landowner. And that's what they're doing by monetizing these natural processes. So it clearly crosses the line as to what is considered property in America.
What does your organization hope to see in terms of staving off, let's say, NACs, Natural Capital Accounts, 30 by 30? What would action on this front look like? Serious action. What do you hope to see if we are to get a different administration, or if we have to anticipate defense again? Depending upon the outcome, what do you hope your organization, or what does your organization rather hope to see on this front? What could be done to deter this movement, to bolster property rights, to make sure that there are multiple uses on public lands? What do you all hope to see?
Yeah, certainly, of course, rescinding this executive order and then digging out all of the 30 by 30 programs, or the retooling of existing programs for the intent of locking up 30% of our lands and oceans. And I might mention also that today is for the environmentalists, what they celebrate is their Half Earth Day. It's October 22nd, the day that we're taping this. And this is the day that they celebrate their next agenda, which is to permanently protect 50% of the world's lands and oceans off limits to human use by 2050. So we need to start rolling this back. The environmentalists will never get enough. And, they always come in and say, this is about conservation and restoration, and the public will always have access, and you'll be able to, go off-road vehicle, take your off-road vehicles on it. You'll be able to hunt. You'll be able to fish. They'll always be open for recreation, but we're obviously seeing that's not the case. Bears Ears National Monument, the plan just came out, which would eliminate hunting and fishing from, I think, 1.3 million acres
of
in that
the enlarged
area.
monument. Yeah, re-enlarged monument.
Yeah.
Legally.
Yeah.
Re-enlarged monument.
Right. So we know that they will never have enough. And so our agenda needs to be, let's push them back. We need to push them back. So it's stopping 30 by 30, of course. But I think we also need to have a healthy discussion on, does the federal government need to own all this land and control all this land? And I know that for some people that kind of looks scary, because you're thinking, well, we're talking about, are we talking about selling off national parks? No, we're not talking about that at all. The government owns 40% of the land in America. Federal government owns 50% of the West and 27 to 28% of the nation statewide. So that's an awful lot of land. And most of that land is, particularly in the West, is open sagebrush area that is not being used productively in a way, but is increasing the management expense on those lands. And so, we need to start thinking about, is it really appropriate for the federal government to be owning all this, or is it something that would be better managed locally? But speaking specifically to the conservation rule that the Biden-Harris administration implemented on the multiple use lands that the BLM manages, they eliminated multiple use. Wherever they put in a conservation lease, they're eliminating multiple use. And we need to understand that those multiple use lands were set aside by Congress specifically for grazing, recreation, timber, mining, oil and gas. And all of those uses were supposed to be managed in such a way that they could happen simultaneously on the same piece of land. And that was the way that local communities could be supported and have a strong, vibrant economy, and that these lands would always be open to the public for hunting and recreation. But the Biden administration has locked that down. When they create a conservation lease on these lands now that they can with this new rule, then that means they can say no more hunting and fishing, no more grazing.
Exactly.
Conservation is now the priority. And the difference between keeping these lands in multiple use and say something like a national park, which is a special designation and specially protected, is think about when you go into a national park. You have to go in the right gate that they assign that you can go into. You have to pay the right fee. There are certain areas you can go into in the park, certain areas you cannot go into while you're in there. And there's certain times of the day that you can go into that park. In other words, they're highly, highly managed and controlled. People are very limited, given very limited access to those lands. Those are special designated lands that Congress has reserved the power to make those designations. The Biden-Harris administration has taken it upon themselves to basically assume that same power. And through the conservation rule alone, they essentially are specially designating and protecting these lands that Congress directed should be in multiple uses for all of us. If we want to go out and fish and hunt on the multiple use lands, we should be able to do that without having to get permission from the federal government to do that. That's how those lands were to be set aside. So from my perspective, I think that's one of the first steps that we have to take, is we have to get these lands back to their true purpose, which was multiple use. And then we can start dealing with some of the other issues that come along with that. But to begin with, we've got to roll back 30 by 30. And we've got to start protecting those multiple use rights so that they can't be infringed upon in future administrations.
It really does boil down to that. And I know there will probably be some conversations, especially in wake of that Utah lawsuit, will trigger a lot of conversation and debate for sure in our space. And, it is, you're absolutely right. I think people can agree that, and I've seen a lot of people radicalized actually, wanting to have multiple uses, sportsmen and women who were previously unaware. I know at your summit, I've talked about how do you reach those people. Now they've seen that their opportunities to access public lands have been diminished severely. Even in areas where they're told, like you said, they would be reassured that access would be maintained, then they saw that loss of access and those loss of activities there. So people are coming around and then they understand there's that tie into 30 by 30 with that. It does seem a little confusing, but it does all go back to 30 by 30 with national monument enlargements that go beyond the presidential scope of smallest area compatible, which hopefully Congress will address and clarify and fix if we do have a favorable, I would say, makeup of both the House and the Senate and a favorable administration. That's kind of the equation you need in order to see that. But a lot of people we talked to have said that there has to be a conversation about reforming the Antiquities Act, whether that's a serious overhaul or really clamping down on and clarifying what those presidential powers are. Do you designate millions of acres? Is that smallest area compatible? Or does it have to be limited to something like 50,000, 100,000? So that's really where it goes back to. It does go back to 30 by 30. Margaret, as we round out our conversation, where would you like listeners to go to learn more about 30 by 30, NACs, natural capital accounts? Where would you like to send them to?
Sure. Thank you. Our website is really a good resource. We built it to be a place where people can go and learn about these issues. So that would be americanstewards.us. And we have a lot of material on there. It's free. It's downloadable. So I encourage people dig into this deeper. There's a lot to this agenda, a lot of tentacles. And the more informed we are, the more we're going to be able to see the programs coming at us and recognize them as being a part of this agenda or possibly a good thing. But without having the knowledge base of understanding what 30 by 30 is, I think it's very hard to parse what they're putting forward.
It really is. And I think they purposely make it difficult for people to understand this kind of interconnected web of policies, and people get naturally frustrated to learn that it goes back to some sort of grandiose thing like 30 by 30. And when they do find out, they become very disappointed and very nervous. And so it's extremely helpful. Your organization does a wonderful job elucidating and simplifying all of this kind of complex matter. And we're very grateful to have you back on the show. We'll have to not wait months upon months to have you back. I know both of us have had busy schedules, so I really appreciate you coming on right before the election to talk about this kind of under the radar, but still very pressing matter, this 30 by 30 issue and how it is entangled with lands management, access, property rights, and the whole like. So Margaret, thank you so much for coming on, and let's revisit again soon.
Thank you, Gabriella. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.